Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me now. I think I can see the audio going up, but just to be sure, if you would be so kind as to leave a comment to let me know that you can indeed hear me, that would be very much appreciated. Like I said, I for some reason I needed to restart the software in order to get it up and running. For some reason it didn't work. Just having it and saying, hey, this is the mic I want to use. It made me restart to be able to use this mic. So if you can hear me, and you can see me okay, if you would leave a comment, that would be great. That way I know that I'm not just talking to myself, which really, would not be that unusual. But for right now, I'd rather not do it, with an audience. So if you could, even just a yes will work. Like I said, I want to make sure that I am being heard. Okay, good. So, how is everybody today? I hope that you are doing well. I want to talk to you about the book of Daniel. In fact, I'm really excited because I've been doing a lot of reading, a lot of studying on the book of Daniel, and I am super excited about going through a verse-by-verse study of this book. I hope that you are too. Now, you may be wondering why it is that on a channel, on a site called The Revelation Explained, why would we be looking at the book of Daniel? Well, I've got a couple of reasons that I want to share with you. I'm going to share with you that. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the book of Daniel. And then I want to talk to you for just a bit about some controversy about Daniel, because there are a lot of people who believe that Daniel is nothing more than a book of fables or nice stories that were told to encourage God's people when they were suffering and in the midst of persecution. And so what we want to do is try and understand why it is that scholars believe, that many scholars believe that Daniel doesn't have any historical, truth to it. Hey, John, good afternoon to you. Hope that you are doing well as well. I'm doing great. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going I'm going to introduce you to the book of Daniel just real briefly. I'm going to share with you why we're talking about Daniel on a channel called The Revelation Explained. And then I am going to do a little bit of discussion about why certain scholars don't believe the book of Daniel is telling a true story, but instead that it is a book of myths. So we're going to start with the why question. We're going to start with why Daniel? Why Daniel on this channel? Well, here's the reason why. Because Daniel serves as the foundation for so much that we read about in our New Testaments, for so much of Jesus, the way that he saw himself and his whole mission, and also for the book of Revelation itself. Daniel is a huge influence on the book of Revelation. Let me just give you a couple of examples of this. When Luke opens his gospel, he opens it with a couple of stories where Gabriel, one of the angels of the Lord, appear and deliver the news that John is going to be born and that Jesus is going to be born. Where does Gabriel come from? Well, he comes directly from the pages of Daniel. And so we have a direct connection from Daniel to the Gospel of Luke and those birth narratives. And then when we think about, there's a lot of sayings that Jesus says, a lot of things that he says where it's obvious he has Daniel in the back of his mind. Every time Jesus says the Son of Man has come and talks about himself in the terms of, that he's the Son of Man, he is referencing Daniel, and he's connecting what he's doing to what Daniel prophesied some 6 centuries before. Also, there are several sayings where where Jesus rather talks about the rock falling on, there's one quote where he talks about the rock falling on a people who don't believe, and it crushes them and turns them to dust. That's directly out of Daniel chapter 2. Jesus quotes Daniel whenever he's at his trial, and the ruling council is asking him questions. The Sanhedrin is asking questions about his ministry, about who he is. He responds with a quote from Daniel. So Daniel is sort of an incubator for the early Christians and for Jesus and for his ministry. They saw what Daniel was doing as being fulfilled in Jesus. In fact, I would argue that when Jesus first preaches and says the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven is at hand, what he's referencing is Daniel chapter 2, where it talks about the stone that's taken out of the mountain without hands. And Daniel explains that is a kingdom that God is going to set up. And what Jesus is saying there when he first begins preaching is the The time Daniel talked about is fulfilled. The kingdom is at hand. So Daniel lies at the foundation of what we believe as Christians, and who Jesus was and what Jesus' mission was and all that. But it doesn't stop there. See, Daniel also is underlying so much of what the book of Revelation is trying to do. One of the things that's interesting about Revelation is that it is a book that sort of ties the ends together for every other book that comes before it. I want to say that there are something like 500 allusions to the Old Testament books in the book of Revelation. And this is a book with, 20-some chapters. And yet 500 times it's referencing Old Testament books. And if you read it, you'll see that. You'll see so many times that sometimes it's just a phrase. Sometimes it's a whole passage. But so much of what John writes in Revelation goes back to what we find in Genesis, in Exodus. This is why we see all the plagues in Revelation go right back to Exodus and those plagues. We see in Revelation 21 at the end where it talks about the city and there being the tree of life and the rivers flowing out of it. I mean, that's all right out of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. So there's a tremendous number of connections, but Daniel probably has one of the greatest influences on the book of Revelation that there is, because there are whole sections, passages of Daniel that basically we find coming back in the book of Revelation. So if we're going to understand Revelation, we really need to understand our Old Testaments very well. And in particular, we need to understand the book of Daniel, because Daniel's prophecies and Daniel's visions and dreams, they come up in the book of Revelation. So I thought, this is a great way for us to start. Now, that's the first reason, because it sort of underlies our study of Revelation, and it underlies what we believe as Christians in general. There's another reason, though, that I think Daniel's a great book for us to study right now, and it's this, that Daniel gives us a sort of plan, a game plan, if you will, for living in the midst of a hostile culture. If you read the book of Daniel, especially the first 6 chapters, what you find are story after story after story of Daniel and Daniel's friends getting in jams and God coming and delivering them. And we see what it looks like to live faithfully to that God who is a delivering God in the midst of a culture that hates you and ultimately wants you dead. I mean, that's what Daniel's experiencing. Now, we don't necessarily live in a culture where it wants us dead, but we certainly live in a culture that is not friendly toward Christianity, toward Scripture, toward what God desires. And so what Daniel gives us is some really good practical, tangible advice, if you will, by example, of how to live faithfully in a hostile culture. So that's the second reason I think that studying Daniel right now is just a great thing for us to do. The third reason is that Daniel is way easier than Revelation. And I thought, if we're going to do a verse-by-verse study, I think it would be great to start with the book of Daniel, because it's a little easier to get our arms around. The visions in Daniel are a little more easy to understand than the ones in Revelation. And so it's going to lay a foundation, and it's a little bit simpler. So we're starting, if you will, with sort of a step 1 before we move on to the book of Revelation. So this is just, all in all, these are the 3 reasons why we're going to do this verse-by-verse study through the book of Daniel. It serves as a foundation for the New Testament, and in particular for Revelation. It offers us an important picture of how to live faithfully in a hostile culture, and it's easier. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted it. So let me give you just a few thoughts about Daniel as a book, what it's talking about, who it's concerning, and all of that. Let me set the stage for you, if you would. Judah, which is the southern kingdom of Israel, had been invaded by the Babylonians around the year 600 BC. I think the official date of when everything took place was 597 BC. But it's around this time that Babylon is beginning to gain greater control, is getting more and more powerful, and is encroaching westward. Because Babylon is over in the east, where modern day Iran, Iraq, that kind of, Iraq, that area, that's where Babylon is. And so they've come west, and they have begun taking over sort of one area after another. And in particular at this time, they're moving into Egypt, which is one of the other major world powers of the time and in years past. And so Israel and Judah finds itself in the middle of all of this. And Babylon comes down, and they come into Egypt, and they come into Judah and into Jerusalem, and they besiege Jerusalem, and they carry off a number of young people, as well as other people, and exile them. And so we have this very well-known event in Old Testament history called the exile. And their exile taken away and brought to Babylon. And there we have several prophets that wrote during this exile, including Ezekiel. Jeremiah is writing right before all of this takes place. And Daniel is another one he and his friends are some of the first people who are taken from Jerusalem over to Babylon and exiled there. So here's Daniel. He's probably in his early teens, okay? With the word that's used, it's a young teenager or maybe younger. And so he's a really just what we would call a boy. A young teenager. He's in a foreign place among a foreign and hostile culture. This is, you want to talk about culture shock. This is culture shock. And now Daniel and his friends are living in this foreign place, and they have to navigate and figure out, how do you live faithfully to the God of Israel, a God who has placed all kinds of demands on how you're supposed to live, what you're supposed to do, where you're supposed to eat, on and on. How do you live faithful to that God while you're living in the midst of a hostile culture that's demanding of you things that God requires you not to do? This is the setting for Daniel's book. Now, if Daniel was about 15 when he first was exiled and brought to Babylon, he probably died when he was around 85. So there's about 70 years worth of material that the book of Daniel covers. And this is only a 12-chapter book, and yet we've got 70 years of material that takes place from beginning to end. And over that time, not only Daniel lives through the entire Babylonian empire of his day. And so what you'll see is there are stories concerning Babylonian kings, like Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar. And then you also have the stories of Persian kings, like Darius the Mede, who's associated with him, and he's one that we'll have to get into. But we have from the whole Babylonian Empire and into the Medes and the Persian, their empire. And Daniel lives for 70 years in Babylon and finally dies around the year 535 BC. So this is the period of time of the book of Daniel. So I would encourage you, if you haven't read the book of Daniel in a while, take this week and read it with an awareness that these events are taking place over a lifetime that's, about 70 years worth of time. Daniel, like I said, is probably about 85 by the time that he dies, if he is 15 or so, whenever he is first brought to Babylon. So that's a little bit about sort of the setting and about the people. Now, let me share with you just briefly about the structure of the book of Daniel, because Daniel is structured in a very intentional kind of a way. If you read Daniel from beginning to end in one sitting, what you'll find is that the first 6 chapters are very different from the second 6 chapters. Chapters 1 through 6 are stories. They are stories of Daniel arriving in Babylon, living in Babylon, suffering, trying to deal with all the craziness of living in this hostile culture, and then also living among the Medes and the Persians. So those are the first 6 chapters. These are the chapters that we all know. These are the chapters that you hear about in Sunday school, that you read in your picture Bible as a kid. These are the stories of Daniel in the lion's den, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace, and Daniel refusing to eat the food from the king's table, and all of those stories are found there in the handwriting on the wall at Belshazzar's big party. The first 6 chapters are all these stories. And when you read them, they all follow sort of a similar pattern, where Daniel and his friends are put up against, they're sort of put in a jam. They're in a situation where they have to choose whether they're going to live faithfully to God or whether they're going to give in to the culture, whether they're going to let God work in their life or they're going to trust the kings and the ideas of the Babylonians. And so each one of these stories begins that way. They're in a jam, and they have to make a decision. And then we see that they make a decision, and they make that decision to be faithful to God. And as a result of that decision to be faithful to God, God delivers them. And we see that again and again and again and again as we go from chapters 1 through 6. They're put in a jam. They have to decide who are they going to be faithful to. They choose to be faithful to God. God delivers them. And pretty much every time, God doesn't just deliver them, but God also lets his glory be known and makes, his renown is put forward. So much so that there are several of these kings who, when they see what happens, like Darius is one, like Nebuchadnezzar is one, when they see what happens with Daniel, when they see how his God works, they praise his God. Now, this doesn't mean they become Jewish or they start to worship God alone, but they recognize that the God of Daniel is one of the gods. They probably still would have believed in all of the other gods, but they would have recognized that Daniel's God is a God and that he is a powerful, powerful God because of what he's able to do. So that's chapters 1 through 6. Now, if you keep reading, when you cross over the line into chapter 7, you're probably going to get whiplash because you've just gone from reading about Daniel in the lion's den and this wonderful story that we all know and so easy to comprehend and understand what's going on and even apply to our life. You move into chapter 7, all of a sudden you get hit by vision after vision after vision. And for 6 chapters, from chapter 7 through 12, we have visions of just all kinds of stuff. Visions of goats, and rams and visions of beasts and horns and just all kinds of very visual, imaginative visions that Daniel receives. And in the midst of all this, the angel Gabriel comes and talks to him about what those visions mean. And so from chapter 7 on, we don't get any of the familiar stories about, the being thrown in the fiery furnace or anything like that. From chapter 7 on to chapter 12, to the end of the book, we have just visions of what God is going to do in the coming days. So this is the way the book of Daniel is structured. 6 chapters that deal with Daniel's sort of exploits in Babylon and among the Medes and Persians, and then 6 chapters of visions about what God is going to do in the future days, and that God is revealing to him and that he's explaining to him. So, throughout Christian history, it was believed that Daniel wrote most of this book, and that he wrote it during the 6th century, right, when he lived. It would be hard for him to write it after he lived. But during the 1800s, there was a shift that took place in the way that people studied the Bible and read the Bible. There was this move towards what they call critical scholarship. And critical doesn't just mean I'm going to try and criticize you. It's not as if they were just purely out to criticize Scripture or the Bible or God or anything like that. But basically, it was an approach to the Bible that says we're going to look at this as if it's any other book. And we're going to look at it and examine it and study it as if it is, any other piece of history. And so we're going to remove any kind of dogma, any kind of creed. We're not going to, have a particular doctrinal idea about this or belief about what's true and what's not. We're not going to look at it from a sectarian perspective. We're going to use reason and reason alone and the scientific method to try and understand what's going on here. And so when they did that, there were a couple of assumptions, and there's one big assumption that they made that impacted the way they read the book of Daniel and understood it. One of the big underlying assumptions, if you're going to read something critically like this, and if you're going to try and read it like any other book, is the assumption that they make is that you can't give anything a supernatural explanation. You can't assume that miracles, a miracle actually took place, because we don't experience miracles on a daily basis. So since we don't have any experience with that, we have to assume that they didn't either. And what they're writing about is either they were confused or there's a natural explanation for it. Sometimes maybe you've heard that before. Well, there's got to be a reasonable explanation, a natural explanation. And so this critical scholarship looked at every book of the Bible and said there's got to be a physical, natural explanation for this. And this is how you get things like whenever they talk about Jesus walking on the water and saying that he really didn't walk on the water, really there was just a sand dune, that was under the water, and that he was walking on top of that sand dune. They're taking a biblical event, and they're trying to explain it in a natural way, so you don't have to invoke God or angels or the supernatural, or any of that kind of stuff. So during the 1800s and the 1900s, when this became a very popular way, and really the way to do serious Bible scholarship, Daniel presented a problem. And the reason Daniel presented a problem was because if you read Daniel chapter 11 in particular, and really Daniel 2 is this way, and there are several other passages in Daniel that are this way. I mean, 8 and 11, though, is just really clear. 11 is a prophecy about the 2nd century, Israel's 2nd century, okay? It's a prophecy in particular about a king named Antiochus IV, who was a very wicked king who lived up north of Israel and who was sort of in charge. And after Alexander the Great's empire split up, it broke up into several kingdoms, and one of them was the Seleucid kingdom, which was based in Syria, and Antiochus IV was over that kingdom. And he did some really, really bad stuff. He came into Jerusalem. He desecrated the temple. He got pigs, and they sacrificed pigs on the altar, which if you know anything about Israel and about the Old Testament and about Jewish thinking, the idea of sacrificing a pig and pig blood, I mean, pigs were like the worst of the worst. You didn't eat them. You didn't keep them. You certainly didn't sacrifice them. And you didn't bring them into the holy place. They were unclean. And so to take them into the temple and sacrifice these pigs just desecrated the temple. He wouldn't allow the Jewish people to circumcise their sons, which again, was a huge thing because circumcision was the seal of the covenant that God had given Abraham. And so to not allow them to do this was, in the Old Testament, there's places where God says, if your sons aren't circumcised, they'll be cut off from their people. And so for him to come in and is forcing the people to break the covenant and is desecrating everything that they hold dear and holy, he was just the one of Israel's most well-known, most wicked leaders. And he wasn't a leader over Israel, but one of the most wicked people that Israel had ever gotten involved with and in. And so as a result of this, we have in Daniel 11 a detailed description of Antiochus's of what he would do. And it's not like a lot of other prophecy. When you think of people today, of fortune tellers and things, they'll tell a prophecy that's so vague that no matter what happens, it's true. This is not like Daniel 11. Daniel 11 is down to troop movements and things of what Antiochus is going to do. So this is very detailed. Now, when these critical scholars came to the book of Daniel and they're reading chapter 11, they think, well, this won't do. Because if this was written in the year, in the 500s, and it didn't happen until 160s, 170s, then this would have to be a supernaturally given series of documents, right? This vision would have to truly be supernatural. And because they assume that it can't be supernatural, they just decided, well then, this had to be written after the fact. So the popular view that came into being was that Daniel was not written by Daniel. It wasn't written by anybody who knew Daniel. It wasn't written in the 500s when Daniel lived. It wasn't written in the 400s or the 300s or the 200s. It was written in the 2nd century. And it was finished around 164. And the reason they put it at that date around there is because everything that the author writes, everything that Daniel prophesies, we see leading up to that moment, 164. And we don't see, in their eyes, anything beyond 164 taking place. Now, I would argue that in Daniel 2, when the stone that's cut out from the mountain comes and crushes the feet of the big idol, the big statue, I would argue that was Jesus setting up the kingdom of God in the time of the Romans. But that's beside the point. They wouldn't see it that way. They would argue that there is nothing that Daniel prophesies past 164, so Daniel had to be written at the earliest at 164 BC. It had to be, that's when it had to be finished, was around that time. Because by then, everything had taken place that Daniel supposedly prophesied. In other words, these critical scholars argue that Daniel could not have been written early, but it had to be written at a much later date. Now, I started to do some digging in this, and some research, because I wanted to know what exactly was the evidence for this. Why do we say this? And there's a handful of things. I'm going to share with you a couple reasons that I found, and then one of them I won't be able to get in too much because I really want to leave it for its own video because there's so much there. The first one is this, that they'll say Daniel is in the wrong part of the Hebrew canon. For those of you that don't know, the Hebrew canon is just the Old Testament, the books that are a part of the Old Testament. If you go and you find a Jewish Bible, what you'll find is that the Jewish Bible is divided up into three parts. The Torah, which is the law, and that includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then you have the Nevi'im, which are the prophets, and that includes Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all of the minor prophets. And then you have what's called the Ketuvim, which is the writings, and that would be Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs and stuff like that. In the prophets also is Joshua and Judges and 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. And then the writings, the Nevi'im, are all of the other books, okay, all the rest. And so Daniel happens to be, this is the peculiar thing about this, Daniel is not in the prophets in the Hebrew canon. He's not included in the prophets. Instead, he's included in the writings in the Ketuvim. And they believe, so you might say, well, what does that matter? How does that have anything to do with the date of Daniel? Well, I would argue that it really doesn't have anything to do with the date of Daniel. But let me explain to you why they think that it does. The reason they think that it does is because they believe the Old Testament was canonized and made authoritative in 3 steps. And that first you have the Torah. That's the oldest part. That's Genesis through Deuteronomy. And so the Torah was sort of signed, sealed, and delivered. And that became that became the Jewish canon. And then some years later, all the prophets were collected, and they were added to it. And so that was the second part. And now you had a Jewish canon that included both the law and the prophets. And this is why we hear sometimes things like Jesus say, on them the whole law and the prophets hang. Because then you had this part. And then later, after the law and the prophets were sort of standardized and said these books are authoritative, then there was a third set of writings that they just called the writings, and they were canonized last. And so they are the youngest. And so Proverbs, Psalms, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Chronicles, Daniel, etc., they are all the youngest according to this theory. The problem with this is that there are Psalms and Proverbs, as well as other parts of the writings, that are indisputably old. Like as old as some of the books that are in the prophets, and older. And so, if this was just a clean, easy 3-step process, and the Torah is the oldest, the prophets are the second oldest, and the writings are the youngest and the most recent, then where would those writings, like those Psalms and those Proverbs and those different pieces, where would they have been? Would they have just been sort of floating around somewhere? Would they have been in with the law? Well, certainly not. I mean, we all recognize, as has always been recognized, that the law consisted of the Torah, of just Genesis through Deuteronomy, the books of Moses. So they wouldn't have been there. And we don't have any evidence they were ever considered part of the prophets. So where would they have been? Well, here's the reality, is that recent scholarship has shown that things were not quite that easy, that things didn't happen quite that simply, that in fact, the scriptures were canonized earlier than what they expected. There was a time when they said that the Jewish scriptures weren't canonized and all of them made authoritative until 90 AD 90, or even later. And if we do a little bit additional research and begin to look, what we find is that there's actually evidence of a canon being set out that includes the Torah, the law, the prophets, and the writings a century before Christ, plus. In Sirach is a book that's part of the Apocrypha, and so if you've ever read a Catholic Bible, you'll find it in there. It's also called Ecclesiasticus, I think. Sirach actually has parts on it that are... it has a prologue to it, and in that prologue, it mentions this threefold division of the law, the prophets, and the rest of the books, is the way it describes it. So it seems as though there was an understanding that it was already divided up this way well before what many modern scholars had sort of assumed. And not only that, but there's some people that will say Sirach didn't know Daniel, and so Sirach, it doesn't matter what Sirach says, even though he was earlier. But there are actually parts of Sirach that scholars have shown depend on Daniel, and these parts were written around 180 BC. And if Sirach wrote using Daniel, he used Daniel in 180 BC. Then Daniel had to be written before 164 BC, when scholars say it couldn't have been written before that because of the prophecies. Do you see what I'm saying? So this whole idea of Daniel's just in the wrong category. He should have been in the prophets if he was a real prophet and if he was old. It just doesn't hold water. It doesn't hold up. So we might ask, why wasn't Daniel in the prophets then? If he was, a prophet, if his writings were genuine and the real deal, why isn't he back there? Well, here's what I would say: that Daniel's not a traditional prophet, because if you read every other prophet in the Old Testament, whether it's Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel or any of those other books, what you'll find is that there was a clear speaking God's word to the people. Whereas Daniel is told to conceal the word and seal it up. And that's in Daniel 12, verse 4. And so there was this sense in which Daniel was different than many of those other books. Also, some of the other books that are in the writings are, taking place around the same time as Daniel. So it just is something that is sort of a red herring. It's something that they can say, well, Daniel's not in the right place, but it doesn't really hold any water. Daniel was viewed as a prophet, as someone who was a genuine person who lived and breathed and who did the things that it says from very early on. And in fact, if he wasn't written, if the book of Daniel wasn't written until 164, it's beyond belief that you would have so many books written right after that already considered Daniel scripture. And people that quoted him and viewed him as a genuine prophet. There's the Dead Sea Scrolls have lots of places that refer to Daniel. I believe 1st and 2nd Maccabees talks about Daniel as a prophet. So this is something that is obvious. Daniel was well known within the 2nd century, and it makes no sense that his book would be written in 164 and within just a few years he would be viewed as this authoritative prophet. It makes far more sense that Daniel had been a prophet all along, and that his being placed by the Hebrew canon into the writings was just one of those things, but that it had nothing to do with when it was written or how it was written. So that's one of the first reasons, though, that they'll say. The second one is that they'll say nobody mentions Daniel in the Old Testament. In fact, there's a quote from the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. It says, apart from the book that bears his name, Daniel does not appear as a historical personality of the exilic period in any biblical book. In other words, the only book that talks about Daniel is Daniel's book. And to that I say, well, so what? That's how Malachi is. I mean, Ezekiel, he's not talked about anywhere else. There's lots of people that aren't talked about anywhere else. And so this to me is not even, it's a red herring. It's just something else that they can throw on to say, hey, look at this. And at first glance, you think, wow, what evidence? But the reality is there's no evidence there. It's just air, So anyway, I actually looked up Daniel's name, and what you find if you look up Daniel in a Bible is there is a Daniel mentioned twice in Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 14:13-14, it says, Son of man, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it, destroy its supply of bread, send famine against it, and cut off from it both man and beast, even though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, by their own righteousness they can only deliver themselves, declares the Lord God. And then over in Ezekiel 28:3, we read, Behold, you are wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that is a match for you. Now, if you look at the dictionaries and you listen to the scholars, they'll say, well, that's not the same Daniel. Ezekiel says, Behold, you are wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that is a match for you. They'll say that. That's not the same Daniel. Instead, they found a document, an ancient document that's got a Daniel that was a ancient pagan hero. And they say Ezekiel was talking about that ancient pagan hero, which, as I see it, just makes zero sense. Because in this passage, in Ezekiel 14:13-14, Ezekiel is specifically talking about and saying, listen, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job, how righteous they were if they were in a city. He says, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, I stretch out my hand against it, destroy its supply of bread, send famine against it, cut off from it both man and beast. Even though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in its midst, by their own righteousness they could only deliver themselves. He says, even if Daniel, Noah, and Job were in this city, they wouldn't be able to save this city because of their righteousness. And so he's holding up this Daniel as a particularly righteous people. And what you're trying to tell me is that this is a pagan hero, a pagan judge and king, and that Ezekiel is using him as a example of righteousness. And if you read the handful of mentions that we have of this pagan mythic Daniel, what you'll find is that none of them talking about him being particularly righteous. None of them talk about him being a wise man. And yet here in these passages we see, in Ezekiel 14 and Ezekiel 28, we see that Daniel's described as being both wise and being righteous. We don't see that in this mythic Daniel. To me, it makes far more sense that Ezekiel is talking about Daniel. Because here's the thing, and there's some people that say, well, Ezekiel was living at the same time as Daniel, and that's true. But there's about 30 to 40 years between when Daniel lived and when Daniel first got to Babylon, and when the whole thing with the fiery furnace, it's about 30, 40 years between all of when Daniel's there and when Ezekiel's writing. And it makes perfect sense that if Daniel had done what we read about in Daniel chapters 1 through 6, that word would have gotten around to the rest of Israel. I mean, they would have known, all the exiles living in Babylon would have known who this was. And it makes perfect sense that Ezekiel, who's writing, again, as an exile, that he would invoke the name of Daniel. And in particular, when it says, behold, you are wiser than Daniel in Ezekiel 28:3, there is no secret that is a match for you. There is nobody in the whole Bible that applies to better. Here's why I say that. Because not only did God reveal the secret of the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, but God revealed the dream itself. You know, even Joseph, if you go back into Genesis, even Joseph only got the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. But he had to listen for what the dream was. You know, Pharaoh told him the dream about the 7 fat cows and the 7 skinny cows and all that. But Daniel didn't even have to get told what the dream was. Instead, as it says there was no secret that was a match for him. Why? Because God revealed it to him. So to me, it makes way more sense that Ezekiel is talking about somebody that was around at the time, Daniel, who had already shown himself as righteous as both Noah and Job. Plus, here's the deal. An argument from silence is never a good argument. So if I say, well, you know, nobody mentions Daniel in the Old Testament, so he must not be real. Because nobody mentions somebody doesn't mean anything. That's an argument from silence. It really doesn't matter. So there's another thing that often gets brought up when we talk about why they date Daniel so late. And it's this whole thing of, you know, okay. Yep. Hopefully you can see this. So in Daniel chapter 2, this weird thing happens. Let me see where it's at. Daniel is talking to Nebuchadnezzar, is trying to figure out the dream. And he gets Daniel to tell him the vision. And let me see. Let me find it. I can't remember the exact. Okay, 2:4. So this weird thing happens right here in verse 4. In chapter 1 of Daniel is all written in Hebrew. And chapter 2 begins in Hebrew. And then we get down to verse 4, and it says this. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. And then it says, O king, live forever. Now, in a Hebrew copy, when you get to O king, live forever, it switches from being written in Hebrew to being written in Aramaic. And we might say, well, that makes sense, right? Because the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. And so it's just going to give us the actual words that they said. But the weird thing about it is, once it gets down here to the king replied to the Chaldeans, it's still in Aramaic. And it stays in Aramaic throughout all of chapters 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And it doesn't turn back into Hebrew until chapter 7. So this is kind of a weird thing, that Daniel is written in a couple of different languages. In fact, if you listen to some of, hold on a second. If you listen to some of the scholars, I came across one who made the statement that Daniel's written in 3 different languages. It's written in Hebrew, it's written in Aramaic, and it even has Greek in it. So let's look at this for just a minute. The first thing is this whole claim that it's written in Greek. Nothing in Daniel is written in Greek. There are 3 words in the book of Daniel that are Greek words, and all 3 of them are musical instruments. Think about this for just a minute. Musical instruments, when they go from one culture to another, they generally don't get a new name. Musical instruments just retain the name that they had. Think about the name piano. Piano is not an English word. Piano is an Italian word, because pianos were invented in Italy. In fact, even in Japan, a piano is called a piano. So this whole idea that, it's written in Greek, there's nothing in Daniel that is written in Greek other than 3 musical instruments. And this was a culture, this was a world in which all these different cultures were mixing and were sharing things and sharing ideas and on and on. So it makes perfect sense that you would have had some Greek instruments mentioned in the midst of all this. So the Greek is just a non-starter. There's no reason to even bring it up. But we do have to deal with this whole question of why is Daniel written in Hebrew and in Aramaic? I mean, pretty much half of it's Hebrew, half of it's Aramaic. It starts in Hebrew, goes to Aramaic, moves back to Hebrew for the last half. So why is this? Well, before we get into the why, let's recognize that Hebrew, the dates of these things. The Hebrew in this is practically undateable, so we can't tell much about when it was written. Generally, they say, from what I've read, that it was written between 600 and 2 or 100 BC. So it's a wide range. We really can't say exactly when it was written, but the Aramaic is another story. K.A. Kitchen is a well-known Old Testament scholar, and this is what he had to say about the Aramaic of Daniel. He says, the only indication of a place of origin arises out of the word order of this Aramaic, which betrays Akkadian influence and proves that the Aramaic of Daniel and Ezra belong to the early tradition of Imperial Aramaic that came about in the 7th, 6th to 4th centuries BC, as opposed to later and local Palestinian derivatives of Imperial Aramaic. Let me translate for you. Basically, what K.A. Kitchen says is, if you look at the word order of the Aramaic in Daniel, it shows that it was written between the 6th, 7th century and the 4th century. Well before, like hundreds of years before 164, when all of these scholars want to say Daniel was written. And so this Aramaic shows that it was written very early. In fact, it could have been in the time that Daniel claims to be written in. So this is something that is actually some evidence that Daniel is old, not that it is recent. So we might ask, well, why does Daniel switch languages? Well, I mean, obviously we can't know for a fact why, but there are examples of works being written in this way, with an opening in one language and then moving to a different language for the middle and then moving back to the original language at the end, and sort of sandwiches two languages, one language in the middle of two languages. This is something that it was more common than it is today. In fact, Hammurabi's law code, which you've probably heard before in school, that was written in this way, where there was a language, one language it opened with, and then something else in the middle, and then it closed with something else. So this was not totally unheard of, the idea that you might include these multiple languages. And in Daniel, we see this taking place. There are people who use this to argue that Daniel was written by a couple of different people and sort of patched together. But when you start to read the research and the scholarship and the literature, everything is so just conjectures. Well, maybe it was this and maybe it was that. And, here's a possibility. But here's the reality, is Daniel has a very clear cohesiveness. It's all connected. It's all focused. And it doesn't seem to be a book that was just sort of patchworked together. All the themes from beginning to end, the theme is consistent and continual, whether you're talking about the 6 chapters that deal with the stories or the 6 chapters that deal with the visions. It all has the same exact theme. There is a very strong cohesion to this book. And even in the language, we see that the language is very, cohesive. So it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense that this would be patchwork put together. And there's a lot more that we could say on this, on the whole language thing. A lot of these words, a lot of the things that Daniel uses several words that would have been known by imperial people that were in government back in the time that Daniel was in Babylonian government. So there's just a lot about the way that it's written that makes it seem like at least a core of it goes back to the actual time of Daniel, which again is evidence that maybe Daniel did have a part to play in this, and maybe Daniel was an actual person, unlike what some scholars want to say. So these are a handful of the reasons why scholars don't believe it. But there's really one, there's 2 big ones. This is one of the big ones, and it's historical inaccuracies. They say Daniel is filled with historical inaccuracies. Daniel makes these claims that just aren't true. For example, in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, we read. Hold on a second. All right. in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, this is what we read in Daniel, but if you go over to Jeremiah, it says it was the 4th year of Jehoiakim. And so there are scholars that say, see, Daniel didn't know what he was talking about. Daniel, because he was writing, hundreds of years after this took place, he made a mistake because he didn't really know what was going on. But when you do a little digging, and I'll tell you, there's a great commentary by, let me see, Joyce Baldwin. She talks about how these 2 dates are based off of 2 ways of reckoning time. One of them, Babylonian, that would be Daniel's way because he was in Babylon. The other one, Palestinian, and that would be Jeremiah's way because he was in Palestine. And so this is not some sort of insurmountable, contradiction or something. It's just a matter of the way that they were dating things. One, it was in the 3rd year because he was starting at a different place. The other one, it was in the 4th year because of where he was starting. So a lot of the things that we find here are you just got to dig, and what you discover is there's really not the historical inaccuracy that you think there is. One of the other really well-known historical inaccuracies is Belshazzar. Belshazzar is that king of Babylon at the very end of the Babylonian Empire. And, we all know the story of he's throwing a big feast, and they're eating, and all of a sudden they see a hand writing on the wall. And he wants somebody that can interpret what these words mean that are being written on the wall. And Daniel comes in, and he recites the words and then tells him that he's been measured and found wanting, and that the kingdom's going to be given to somebody else. This Belshazzar, historians didn't know who it was for the longest time, and they thought that Daniel had just made up the name Belshazzar. He had just pulled it out of his hat. Well, it wasn't Daniel that wrote it. They think that this some guy in the 2nd century that was writing this, he just decided, let's talk about the king Belshazzar, and he just sort of made up this name. But as more archaeology was done and more research was done, they found that this name was actually on a list, on a king list. It was actually found, and he was the son of King Nabonidus, I think. Yeah, he was the son of King Nabonidus, who was the last king of Babylon. Now remember, Belshazzar was there right before, when the handwriting happened on the wall and the Persians came in and took over. And so, according to Daniel, it looks like Belshazzar is the last king, but we know from Babylonian records that Nabonidus, his father, was the last king. But here's sort of the answer that we get. I mean, this is the reason why. Is King Nabonidus was known for not hanging around Babylon. And so he was actually in Saudi Arabia when this was going on, and he had left his son, Belshazzar, in charge of the kingdom there in Babylon while he was in Saudi Arabia. And so was Belshazzar the king in the official sense? No, but he was a ruler, and he was ruling as sort of a regent in place of his father, who was the king. And we even see this, if you're really careful and you pay attention, you can even see this in the text itself, because there's this place where Belshazzar tells Daniel that he can become 3rd in the kingdom. Not 2nd in the kingdom, but if he does this, then he'll be 3rd in the kingdom. Well, why is Belshazzar telling him he can be 3rd in the kingdom? Because what Belshazzar is recognizing is that he doesn't have authority to put him in 2nd place, because he's in 2nd place, because his dad's in 1st place. So Daniel could be 3rd. It's kind of like the Pharaoh, if you'll remember when Joseph tells Pharaoh the dream. Pharaoh says, you'll be 2nd in command. Well, Belshazzar says the same thing, but he says you'll be 3rd in command. And the reason is because Belshazzar was 2nd in command, and his father, Nabonidus, was in 1st in command. So this is one of those historical inaccuracies that at first glance people thought, this can't be, that Daniel's made a blunder, whoever wrote it just made this up. And we've done more research, and we discovered that no, he actually didn't make this up. In fact, it's so much so that, and I wish I had the quote right here, I don't have it with me, but there's this one quote where there's a scholar who basically says, we have no idea how Daniel could have known the name Belshazzar, because it's not in any of the big histories or anything like this. It's just in some king lists, some things over in Babylon that we've discovered more recently. We don't know how Daniel knew this name Belshazzar. Well, maybe he knew the name Belshazzar because he was actually around at the time of Belshazzar. Could be. I don't know. Seems like that would make sense. But again, there is this push to find historical inaccuracies anywhere you can find them, and even if they don't hold up, having the historical inaccuracies is really important because Daniel can't be doing what it claims to be doing. So one of the other things that they bring up about Belshazzar is he's called the son of Nebuchadnezzar a couple times, or Nebuchadnezzar is called his father. And so they make a big deal about this because he was not Nebuchadnezzar's son. As I said earlier, he was Nabonidus' son. And so there's this controversy about Daniel doesn't know who Belshazzar really who his father was, and he was confused about who the child of Nebuchadnezzar was, and all this stuff. But here's the thing. The whole word son and father in the Old Testament and in Hebrew culture, and even in Eastern culture in general, there was a common thing that when you talked about somebody that was a sort of in line, you would very often talk about them in kind of a father-son kind of a relationship. Even so, even if you think about more recently and this isn't really recent, but among the Caesars, I think it was it Julius Caesar who adopted Augustus as his son and as his heir. There was a sense in which if you were in line, it's like you were adopted, you were made a son, and so you were a son in kind of a way. And in fact, there's a place in Elijah and Elisha, the stories of Elijah and Elisha. Elisha and Elijah are both prophets of Israel, and Elisha is sort of Elijah's apprentice, and there's a place where he calls Elijah father, I think. And so this was a common thing, that when you had people that were sort of in line, that you would use father-son language to refer to them. And it can even refer to ancestors. So, it's like your father Abraham. Think about Jesus when he makes that comment to the Pharisees. Talking about Abraham as their father. Well, he's not their father. He's not even their grandfather or great-grandfather. He's their ancestor. But very often you would use the phrase father or son to refer to ancestors and descendants. So I say all that because Belshazzar, there is a chance, a decent chance, that Belshazzar was a literal grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and there's no doubt that he was in a line. If Nebuchadnezzar was king and Nabonidus was king and Belshazzar was in the line of being the next king and was acting as king even then he was in line even though he wasn't a literal father. So again, this is just looking for any kind of historical inaccuracy I can possibly find. And when I see that, when I see people stretching and just trying to throw everything they can at the wall and hoping something will stick, when I see that, it really concerns me. Because it tells me that their reasoning is really, really not as good as what they want to let on. One of the last things that reasons why people doubt that Daniel was written when he says it was, is because there's this strong focus on the 2nd century, like I've already said, on the Hasmonean period, the Maccabean period, and on this king, Antiochus IV, and this whole thing. And this is where we get to the rubber meeting the road. And it's this: the reason that scholars don't want to, the reason they come up with all these other things, the reason that they look at these, even really simple things that shouldn't be seen as discrepancies or historical inaccuracies, but they reach for them. The reason there's so much reaching in all of this, the reason they go to things like, oh, but it's written in Hebrew and Aramaic, or, oh, but it's in the writings and not the prophets. The reason they go to these things that are red herrings and that really aren't substantive is because the real reason that they don't want to trust Daniel as being accurate and true is because they don't believe that Daniel could have prophesied what he prophesied. They don't believe that there is a God in heaven who knows the end from the beginning. They don't believe that God is able to give predictive prophecy and for it to be accurate and for it to be true. They don't believe it. And that's the reason. Now, are there scholars out there who are good scholars and conservative scholars and evangelical scholars who do believe that that God can do that and who still hold to this view? Yes, there are. John Goldingay is one of them. But I have a feeling that there is a tendency to want to give in to the larger narrative, to the what everybody else is saying, all the other scholars are saying, and don't want to push back against that. Because we have this supposed mountain of evidence that shows that Daniel was written at such a late date. There are plenty of reasons for us to have confidence in Daniel as a book that truly was written earlier than the events that it prophesies. Now, does that mean that that Daniel, wrote this whole book as it is now and passed it on in 5 whatever? I don't know. There's always a process. And, we see evidence throughout the Old Testament of there being editing, here and there, little things added, clarification words, that are added here and there. But the bulk of Daniel, I think we can have a pretty good confidence that the bulk of Daniel is coming to us as intended, and that the bulk of Daniel was written well before the events of 164, and that the bulk of Daniel accurately prophesies the events of 164, and actually not just then, but the events leading up to 164, and I would argue even some events after 164, when Christ comes and establishes his kingdom. In other words, we can have confidence as we read the book of Daniel that it is what it claims to be. Now, there's so much more. And it's just overwhelming, the amount of information that's here. I really want to look at some of those historical inaccuracies in more detail. And what we'll probably do is, as we go through this verse at a time, we'll hit those as we go so that we can spend more time on them and we're not forced to try and rush through them all at once, which is really what we've had to do today. I just really wanted to give you a kind of foundation for what the book of Daniel is, for why we're looking at it, and also for why there's this controversy about it. But it really, I believe, comes down to people don't believe that God is able to do what God is able to do. And when you start to read the book of Daniel, you see the prophecies for yourself. It's amazing how on target these things are, especially when you consider that they were written hundreds of years in advance. So here's what I want to encourage you to do if you're going to join us next week, which I hope that you will, is read through the book of Daniel this week. Chapters 1 through 12. Won't take you long. It's a short book. But it will prepare you for what we're going to look at next week, right here, Monday at 4 p.m. God bless you, and I will see you then.